Hello,
Hello.
I'm Robert Dilts,
Judith DeLozier here.
and this is our friend Steve Gilligan.
Who are
Welcome,
we?
Steve.
We are so blessed to have, and I feel so blessed to see Steve after so many years.
So many years.
So many years. So.
And given it's the 40th anniversary of the naming of NLP and the publishing of Structure of Magic, it's also our 40th anniversary of having known each other and met each other.
That's
and
right.
our 40th anniversary. So we all go back 40 years. So between us, we're 120 years.
I think we were
That's
like,
a lot.
I think we were like, I was 9.
No, yeah, you must.
Yeah, you were
and
9.
You guys were
I
like
was
8,
19. Yeah, so
I was 3.
you've always been 10 years younger.
And what we want to do in this video is to present to you at the guests of our 40th anniversary celebration. We're going to begin first by talking a little bit about NLP past, and since Steve is not going to be able to be here in person with us, to get his voice, his memories, and his input about what NLP was like back in those days. And
I refer to it as the prehistory because history began for me when I stepped into the path. And I know that you, of the three of us, were part of that earlier history.
Yeah.
Before NLP had
Well,
a
Yeah,
name.
how
you
did
know,
you get-
I actually remember you and I being there, and right, you were, I guess you were living in the house.
I was living in the house, yeah,
where-
but
where
was
we did
not
those first
directly involved.
Well,
For a while,
if
for
I
a
were
while.
if I were to give a brief description of how I got into it, we were all students at UC. I sort of, with my Irish Catholic San Francisco roots, dropped out of school during my second year, went back to San Francisco, worked in a steel mill in the Oakland ghettos, and came to a place where I thought I was going to kill myself. That was really sort of my first sort of dark period. And I had this intense voice inside of me that was just walking around that said, I don't want to live this life. I don't want to live this life. And I thought it meant, and I thought, oh my God, you know, I was raised Catholic. This isn't right. And suppose the 49ers win the Super Bowl, which they did 4 times, and I wouldn't be there.
You would never have known.
But in any case, I had this sort of confrontation, and I decided out of that to come back to Santa Cruz. And
What year would that be?
that was 74,
Okay.
as I remember it. And I came back, and I had to register for some courses. And they said, what do you want to register for? And all the courses were 5 units.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't know. And so I looked in the catalog, and there was this course by a guy named John Grinder called Political Economy of the United States, which was an exhortation to radically overthrow the United States government by any means necessary.
John was always very, very political.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I thought, oh, it's a good course for a Santa Cruz kid, you
That's
know,
right.
and radical Marxism. So I just sort of, like through the Ouija board, if you will, took that course. And then there was a second course by some guy named Batson or Bateson called Steps to an Ecology of Mind.
That looks good.
Yeah.
Overthrow the government and steps to the
Steps to an Ecology of Mind, which was in the Kresge Hall
That's
back
right.
then,
Yes.
the dome, I should say.
Yes.
It was in the dome.
Which
And-
unfortunately this group won't be there, but we have done many programs there.
In the dome.
Yeah.
In the
Is
dome.
it- does it still exist?
We are in the Stevenson Event Center, but
Oh,
the dome
yeah, I
still
know that
exists.
place.
The dome
Yeah,
still
yeah.
exists.
So that's how I got to know those guys, is sort of by coming out of this life crisis. And I think, you know, something inside of me was guiding me. I don't know, but I sort of serendipitously took those courses. This was right at the time then I think that John was hooking up with Richard.
Yeah.
And John was a fantastic young assistant professor.
Yeah.
He was the first professor who basically regarded me as somebody that had something intelligent to say and to contribute. So I started talking with him a lot, and he said, yeah, I'm starting these groups with this guy Bandler. And so that's how I got, and I think I was in the very first group that John and Richard did formally.
Wow.
There were the Bandler groups with Frank.
Yeah,
Yes.
That-
before that.
That people
yeah.
like David Gordon and Mary Beth
Yeah.
and Paul
Terry
Carter,
McClendon.
Terry McClendon.
Yeah.
Right, but these were the first, so there were people, and it was at the house you were renting.
I
right?
was living in that house for, I can't remember the name of the professor, but he was on sabbatical, I think at Cambridge. He was a geneticist. And he lived in the student apartments, and
Yes.
he said, I need somebody to stay in my house. And so
Oh,
there was
wow.
a bunch of us that went, Yahoo, you know, we're students. We got a free house for a year and a swimming pool. What else could we possibly want? And that's where I remember meeting you for the first time. I was not in those groups, but I lived in that house,
God,
and I
that's so
would see
interesting.
people coming and going.
I remember you being in
Yeah.
that milieu.
And I met Richard actually before I ever met John or you or Robert, because Frank brought him over for a cup of coffee one day.
And Leslie was
Leslie was my neighbor. She lived beneath me
Right.
in the student apartment. She got my job for me at the Bellows, and we were waitressing
Wow.
to get through
Wow.
school over
Wow.
there, along with Byron Lewis.
So
Byron
was Byron also in the earlier groups with
You know,
Richard, or did he come in?
He wasn't in
I
those
don't
early.
remember. I
I think he
remember
came in
him
a little
coming
late.
in later. Yeah, kind of coming in later.
And then now you did, because I know because Anita was in a class that you and Paul Carter did,
right?
called Dyads.
That was our first class.
So that was the very first class that you did, right?
Well, Paul always said had chutzpah,
Chutzpah.
the Irish call it.
Yes.
Paul Carter and I were worked together for 10 years, and we discovered this never used course possibility at UC, student directed seminar, where if you could get a faculty to sponsor you,
Yeah.
you could teach a class. So Paul said, why don't we teach a class? And I said, on what? He said, human dyads. I said, great. And it was only the night before. I said, what's a
What is that
dyad?
anyway?
But we got free books. And
all had the
we
word
thought maybe
dyad.
there'd be 10 people. And we walked in, there's 100 people packed
Oh
in
my
this room.
God.
And Anita was in that class. Huh?
Oh, that's
she was.
hysterical.
So we did like 6 quarters, I think, straight.
Wow.
Where we get like Bateson or Grinder or Ted Sarbin
Yeah.
to sponsor them, and we got us into a lot of trouble on the campus because that was the early days of the meta model group,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and things were pretty
Wild.
experimental.
Yes.
Yeah,
Experimental,
that's my
experimental.
memory. That
Well, let's talk a little bit about that because I'm sure that the group would be really interested in knowing how did NLP develop? I mean, so there would be these groups, these meta groups.
There'd be, I think, maybe 10, all of them students, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And the groups I was in was the development of the meta model.
Yeah.
So these were early, very basic sort of groups where we'd come in and John and Rich would say, who wants to change tonight? People would raise their hand, and then there'd be 3 or 4 of us had to go into a back room.
Right. Oh, yes.
And then the rest of the people were going to be the quote-unquote therapists, and they were drilled in one meta model question.
and you just keep asking it over
Right.
and over.
What specifically? What specifically? And people were enthusiastic and
Yes,
committed.
they were. I do remember that. I do
So
remember
it sort of was this intense thing, but we weren't really opening up a lot of differentiation and complexity.
So then when and it was was it around the publication of Magic 1 that they first went to see Erickson because
Right.
Bateson read the manuscript.
Right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Sent
And
them down,
that's-
and then things really got wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think they were pretty wild with the meta model.
Yeah.
I think it just opened this complementary,
Yeah.
sort of the anti-meta model,
Yeah.
which is what happens if you're using language to just
Right.
open spaces where people would have to experientially fill in all the
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yeah.
And so they went out, I think that was end of 74, beginning of 75, and John and Richard went out to see Erickson. At that time, there was sort of the beginning of an Erickson wing and a Satir wing in those early groups.
Yeah.
And so they came back, and I just fell head over heels about Erickson. I mean, it was like, I still remember it. It was like this fire, just lit in my soul. So when they went back, I think like 3 months later, and I went with, and you went with them.
I did.
Yeah,
I
you were
did.
there.
I didn't go.
You
in
and
the
me
fir-
went
I didn't go
together.
the first time, but yeah, that's right.
The second
The
time.
second
That's
time.
right. And Leslie.
And Leslie.
And then Bob and Becky,
Becky Spitzer.
Right,
And,
right.
and Milton said Bob and you and I think Eric, John and Richard showed up and Eric said, "Where's the girls?" and he made Bob Spitzer go get us.
Where were you?
At the hotel, I guess. But he just didn't.
Boy,
Where's
that's
the
a
girls?
surprise. I didn't remember that. But I do remember Erickson working with you and Leslie.
Yes.
With
the hands, disappearing hands. I do too.
Because I asked, he would always come out and say, "What do you want to know today?"
Yeah.
And I found out very early that it would really be helpful if you gave that some thought. And if you asked him a question, he would be off and running. And so I said, well, I've been intrigued with this stuff about visual dissociation, but I'm not sure how it works. And he turned to you and Leslie, and I remember it so well. He said, "You're good trans subjects."
Right.
Yeah.
What do you want to disappear today?
But it was ostensibly a question,
Yeah, right.
but both of you,
Yeah, we're like, whatever.
Quite a suggestion. Yes, Milton.
Yes, Milton, exactly.
and he had you in the middle of nowhere, and then he said you're going to open your eyes and you're going to see a pair of hands, and he had the oldest, gnarliest
His
hands,
hands.
And you guys were so funny. I just remember both you and Leslie looked like these 6-year-old girls,
Yeah.
and I think you said, he said, "What do you see?" And I think you said, "It's like a pair of praying hands."
Exactly what I said.
Drawing on your
And then he
religious
sort of went,
background.
"Is it praying or praying?"
Praying.
Or praying.
And Leslie said, "It's like you have nothing up your sleeve,"
Sleeve, exactly.
which
We all know.
he
that.
elicited a good laugh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Milton came into the picture then,
That's right.
and that sort of was sort of my path.
Yeah.
I felt such a strong connection to Erickson. In some ways, that was ultimately my divergence
Yeah, it was.
from NLP, the main road of NLP.
And I was trying to remember the first time I met you. I think, I mean, because I knew about you, but I think actually Anita might have introduced me to
Is
you
that so?
on campus one day, and just having this conversation, and I just remember whatever this first conversation was, we were talking about something, and I was reflecting on something, and you pointed out, "Oh, I notice your shoulders go up when you talk about that," or something. And I was like,
Very interesting.
oh, but it was sort of like, wow, he's right, and so it was but I just remember going, that's somebody who's paying attention,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Well, I think that was something that those early groups
yeah,
were so focused on,
yeah,
which is get out of your theories.
Yeah.
And I know
Come to your
Richard,
senses.
Richard would just say, burn up the maps,
Yeah.
and connect and pay attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we were,
Go
like
to
trying to be
experience
like,
first.
do deep transidentification with Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, actually, and I remember that was one of the things. Remember, you were reading. I think you read the collected works of Sherlock Holmes, which I did later too. But it was
At Grinder's suggestion.
yeah. So,
I don't remember. I remember you and Anita always being together, but
Yeah.
as I remember it, John was saying, "Oh, this is Robert. He's like the new kid who's just brilliant or something." And I remember it through John's introduction
yeah, John
of
did
these
bring me
sort of flattering
into
words.
the
And
groups.
you were really first in John's
Yeah.
university courses,
Yeah.
right?
That's where
That's
Robert
where we
and I
met.
met,
Uh-huh.
was in the syntax course.
Mm.
Baby syntax.
Yeah, syntax
Mm.
20 with another 100 and 200
30
people or
people,
something.
yeah.
That many people,
It
wow.
was a huge,
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we'd and then we went up to the groups, and I remember the eye movement thing was beginning, and we were looking in each other's eyes
For eye movement.
for the first time of
Yeah.
actually consciously looking for eye movements.
And Robert put me in my first sort of trance outside of Milton Erickson's,
Yes.
or it brought me
Remember
out
that.
of my
I
trance or
remember that.
something.
So Steve, what would you say were what would you say were sort of the main things that characterized those early days? I mean, if we were going to try, if we were like trying to share, okay, what is it that
Well, yeah.
would be for modern day?
Or what are three sort of words that really would, you'd say, capture the spirit of that?
Burning intensity,
Yeah.
playfulness,
Yeah.
and curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
You know,
I agree.
and we wrote these chapters for the early days book, and one of the things I was pointing out was, there was at least as strong an emphasis in those days in terms of burn the models.
Yes.
Particularly Richard. I mean, he would just go on these rants about there's this school and they say this and they say this, and I was brought back to me a little bit in his little video, and so it was like, let go of all your thinking and make the direct connection.
Yeah.
And that was so incredible. And then just notice and then see how you could play with whatever distinctions that you were noting, and to see if you could open up some creative space.
I think that's so powerful. I mean, I think, because one of the things that I think I'm part of our, even what is the thread, I think, through all the different developments of NLP and its, how it's fanned out, is that notion of modeling. I think that is the essence of modeling, which is exactly as you described it. Find some kind of pattern, begin to play with it. What can you do with it, and not be trapped by a theory, but
Right.
Or technology, yeah.
Yeah, and I've had very mixed feelings over the years about how I hear some NLP people talk about modeling.
Yeah.
Because again, you've got more of these contextual ideas that can be mapped out in so many ways, and then you have this more literalized version.
Yeah.
And some of the ideas about model, I mean, when I first went to model Milton Erickson, back then in the visual kinesthetic auditory, we thought everything could be reduced to a sequence of those, and then somebody could learn it and then reproduce that behavior, which is, just total hogwash. So I went to see Milton, and I said, Milton, I'd like to ask you some questions. He said, go right ahead. He said, when you work with somebody, do you have a lot of internal dialogue? No. Visual images? No. Kinesthetic? No. What do you have? I don't know. How do you know what to do? All I know is I have an unconscious mind.
And it shows up.
And they have an unconscious mind. We're sitting in the same room together, therefore trance is inevitable. I wrote down trance.
Yeah.
So I had, Erickson is always such a big contextual presence in, I think, throughout the history of NLP.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And how Erickson would talk about modeling would be very different from the sort of the more reductionistic left hemisphere.
Yeah.
And I think you guys, you and John, with the turtles all the way down, is that you start talking about modeling in this contextual, somatic way, which to me is, for my own personal sense, the more helpful way to think about modeling.
Well, I think that was my feeling at the time too, that for all intents and purposes, the system of the body was sort of just the vessel that held emotion and nothing more.
Right.
Not that wasn't changing, but it was sort of, that was the myth in my thinking at the time, and going, it's not really honored as a full-on system of mind and that learns and codes and decodes and has memory. That was one of my flags, man. That's my banner.
I would want to say on the record that I think Judy has brought that in more than anybody.
Yes.
And really brought this whole sort of somatic intelligence base to, and still it hasn't entered a lot of areas of NLP.
No, I think you're
And
right.
I think until
No,
it does,
you're right.
it's going to be too reductionistic a way of proceeding.
I think that and field or
Yeah.
community, whatever we
That's
call
right.
that.
So,
I think
yeah,
those two
I
pieces,
agree.
yeah.
I agree.
to wrap up on that, because I think we're already starting to leave a little bit NLP past. Steve,
Okay.
any final words about, to reflect on that past of NLP? Anything that you think would be particularly important or valuable for?
I think it's that spirit, and I was reading, when I read about like Steve Jobs or hear him talk, I see something very similar.
Yeah.
I came of age in San Francisco in the '60s, so I had like the Grateful Dead as, and that whole experimental scene.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you would take Milton Erickson, early NLP, Steve Jobs,
Yeah.
Grateful Dead, to me those are all examples
Yes.
of what those early days of NLP represented.
Yeah.
And they're always available.
Yeah.
Yes.
Experimental, exploratory,
And
experience.
going back to just letting go of
Curious.
the maps and then using your expertise to try to inform what you encounter that's new. But you have to let go of the maps in order to encounter anything new.
It's beautiful.
Dancing on the edge, always. All those people were dancing on the edge.
I think
which
so.
Is, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
And no limitation. Assume no limit. Yeah, assume no limit.
Thank you.
Well, that's you guys. For
My
sure.
pleasure.